speaker of this conference. She's currently a research scholar at the Boston University School of Public Health. And Claire's work focuses on a broad range of topics, including AI ethics, human rights, behavioral science, and social psychology. And today, Claire will be speaking to us about policymaking around AI law and her work at the Future of Life Institute. Just as a side note, again, we still encourage you to submit your questions via the question chat box, and you can find that on the right-hand side of your swap card screen. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to be talking to you about the policy and law of AI. So this is right. I've been recently working with the Future of Life Institute on AI policy. I have an interdisciplinary background, but I think what is relevant for today is that I've been pursuing a PhD in AI law, and I have a JD and a master's in public policy that focused on this. And this is why I'm really excited because it's an emerging field. And as we're going to talk about today, I believe it's a really important field. By now, at this stage of the conference, you're all very much aware of existential risk. I believe that we should put all possible minds to it, including lawyers and political scientists, not just hard scientists. And so I'm hoping that some of you maybe after this talk will contact me because they're excited to work in this space and we can collaborate or think through these problems together. I'm going to share my slides. So the talk today will be about whether AI law and ethics can address existential risk. And what I really want to focus on is really this seeming trade-off between the short and the long term, which I don't believe is such a big problem. And that, you know, sometimes stop action in the policy realm. So we'll talk about existential risk, the ethical challenges of AI, AI ethics versus the law, and how to address existential risk now. So today, you will know it, we're at a turning point. Obviously, we have nuclear weapons with the capacity of eradicating people on the planet. Now we know that using too many nuclear weapons at once would produce a nuclear winter, and we may not be able to grow food anymore or survive. We are also at a turning point in biotechnology with biohacking and home CRISPR kits and DNA synthesis. We're obviously at a turning point in AI that we're going to talk about, and climate. All of these show new trends. First, we humans have the capacity to influence our destiny on Earth and the destiny of our planet. And we've realized that with climate change, we humans also have now the opportunity to change the course of our own destiny with only a few individual actions. So for instance, an individual could order new DNA and, you know, spread it in the population and introduce new gene combinations that wouldn't have happened otherwise. All of these things, which, you know, should be addressed, are not necessarily. This is an extract from Toby Hart's Precipice. It's a broad estimation of the different probabilities of existential risk. He estimates total natural risk as being 1 in 10,000 chances, and total anthropogenic risk 1 in 6, including, as you can see, unaligned artificial intelligence 1 in 10. So that's basically the riskiest of the different emerging technologies or new human-created risk that he estimates. If you compare it, climate change is about 1 in 1,000. And so the total existential risk generated would be 1 in 6. Yet we're doing business as usual. First, there's cognitive dissonance. So we see it with climate change, for instance. Not everybody even agree that that's real. People are still taking it slow. It's taking a long time to legislate because all the countries have to be aligned, because it's a problem that cannot be resolved just by one country domestically. In law, there's path dependence that we'll talk about later in this talk. And there's also inertia in governance, because we are used to doing things as we've always done them. So in the precipice, as I said, Toby Ord estimates that there's a 10% chance of, or I should say 10% probability, because that's not really lucky, of causing an existential risk from unaligned intelligence. And that can mean putting an end to humankind, or that can mean losing control of our destiny to an AI that would create a suboptimal, unhappy future for us. Why are we saying that AI is an existential risk? So we're talking mostly about AGI, an AI that would have cognitive capacities or intelligence that is similar to those of a human. So basically right now we do have, as you all know, some AIs that are way beyond us at specific tasks, but here we're talking about an AI that would be comparable to a human in most tasks. I want to show you DALL-E because this is a multimodal intelligence that is generative. So you can use DALL-E to create websites, to generate deepfakes in terms of videos or photos, to generate drawings. So this this prompt was make an illustration of an avocado in a tutu walking a dog. And that's that are 3 examples of the output. And I'm showing you this because Toby Ord estimated that if we reach AGI, it may be through a combination of deep learning and reinforcement learning, and it would obviously be multimodal. So that's just to show you that we may be a few steps away. We don't know exactly. You've heard this by now, but there was a survey of experts of the field who were asked, if AGI was possible and when it could happen. They estimated a 10% chance that it happens in the next 10 years and a 50% chance that it happens by 2061. So we may have a bit of time to prepare, but it's still good to use this time. So when we talk about AGI, we use those words: superintelligence, singularity, and the intelligence explosion. Superintelligence would be an AGI that actually is beyond human capacity, not just as us. The concept of singularity is a moment in time where technological progress becomes unstoppable. So it's a turning point and there's no going back. And the idea of the intelligence explosion is that if you have an AGI that creates intelligence that is smarter than it, then it will keep going, and we'll have an intelligence explosion. So I want to talk about a few myths of AI that we at the Future of Life Institute are trying to work on. The first one is that the danger of AI would be a conscious or an evil AI. These things, although everything is always possible, are very unlikely. Right now, there's no hint that AI could ever become conscious. However, there is that AI is becoming competent. And so when we say that AI is an existential risk, we don't mean that it's going to take over the world for its own sake. or that it's going to want to destroy us out of being evil, we're worried about misaligned AI. So the paperclip metaphor was used by Nick Bostrom, was created by Nick Bostrom, and it's the idea that if you optimize an AI system to create an infinite number of paperclip, it's going to end up turning the Earth in a super generator, killing humans or doing whatever it takes to just make an infinite number of paperclips. This is Max Tegmark's analogy. We are not specifically evil to ants, or at least most of us are not. And yet, if we want to create a dam and there is an anthill on our way, we will destroy it. And to your right, you have an example of animals that have aligned their goals with humans nicely. I'm talking about dogs, of course. Another myth is that AI would require robots to take over the world. That's not true. They don't need physical arms. They do need an internet connection, however, which they could easily access. Probably if we created an AGI without boxing it, it would start reproducing itself through the internet. This is James Barrett's metaphor of how an AI could try to get out of the box. Again, not necessarily because it wants to, it probably won't want anything, but because it will have been programmed to accomplish a certain goal, and being released might be part of that goal. So it says, imagine awakening in a prison guarded by mice, not just any mice, but mice you could communicate with. What strategy would you use to gain your freedom? Once freed, how would you feel about your rodent wardens, even if you discovered that created you? Oh, adoration, probably not, and especially not if you were a machine and hadn't felt anything before. To gain your freedom, you might promise the mice a lot of cheese. So that's the idea of an AGI trying to get out. Of course, there are other risks to competent AI, replacing humans in different ways. So job displacement, replacing humans in critical functions where humans do not get the care or the interactions they need with other humans, mass surveillance and control, and mass manipulation. Here we talked a lot about misaligned AGI that's sort of accidental. Of course, whoever creates an AGI first would have a lot of power, and that AGI could be used for evil purposes. Finally, a big risk of AI that could turn existential is lethal autonomous weapons. They are already in use right now. There was a UN report showing that 2 years ago there were some used in Libya. There's a Turkish company right now making more weapons that was covered in the news recently. And although right now they are still expensive and big and mostly owned by governments, once they become smaller and they work in swarms, they could be easily acquired by non-state actors. Not that governments should use them, but it's a risk that could spread. It's also a risk that could combine with AGI or competent AI in other ways, and that poses a threat to humanity. So now that we've just went over existential risk again, to brush up on it, I'd like to get into the ethical challenges of AI and how the fields of AI ethics has grown. I'll give you a few seconds to read this. This is from Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereals that I recommend to everyone here if you're not familiar with it. So in my work, I've tried to categorize the different ethical challenges that gave rise to the field of AI ethics, and I found three main categories. The first one is individual rights violation, and you have the picture of Joy Boulomwini right now because she, has worked a lot on coded bias and how facial recognition systems did not recognize Black women, but she was recognized if she put on a white mask. That's an example of a category of ethical challenges that were posed by AI systems, which violate current laws or existing standards that are recognized upon in society. A second type of ethical challenges are the ones that resembles the classic moral philosophy dilemmas that used to only be thought experiments, but suddenly they become hard-coded into AI systems because we need to program them to be ethical in certain situations when there are trade-offs. For instance, an autonomous vehicles that has only two options to kill two different people. And the third category of ethical challenges are structural changes to society that are introduced by the widespread use of technology. And so I'll go back to each very briefly. So human rights violations, again, those are or individual rights violations. Those are AI systems that are either designed in a way or programmed in a way or that use biased data in different ways, sometimes just because society is biased, and that leads to violations of current law or current rights or current ethical standards. I will play this video because it's a typical example.
Nice. Okay, Noel, you try now. See your hand. Two black. Two black. Yeah. Come again, Sashi. No, two black. What as they do, they get. No, what you have to do, some racialist thing is. I have to use that piece of white. It's a napkin. I'll show you. Nothing again. What's it?
So that's an example of non-inclusive design. Another type of individual, on this one, these are the challenges we've heard a lot about in the past few years in the media, and they contributed to the creation of the field of AI ethics because companies wanted to address these problems, civil society and governments. Now, another type of ethical challenges, again, are the ways that we have to create ethical rules in order to program specific machines, autonomous machines, for instance, autonomous vehicles, but also even lethal autonomous weapons. Right now, there are talks about how to make lethal autonomous weapons comply with international humanitarian law. So that's the famous trolley problem. A person can choose to divert the tram from the main track, saving 5 people on the track, but killing the worker on the other track. All of these used to be thought experiments. If humans had to be in a situation where they had to make such a decision, they really didn't have the time to make such a decision. If you're in your car and you can't predict all the possible outcome, and if you're in the middle of an accident, you probably don't really have the time to think about moral philosophy. However, now we do, because we have to hard code these ethical challenges and values into the systems themselves, which leads to kind of new ethical debates in society. The third type of ethical challenges are the structural challenges brought to society by the widespread use of AI. So, for instance, even if there is no necessary individual rights violation. So, for instance, the job displacements, the problems around the attention economy with social media, the increased polarization of society. So all of those are challenges that are brought because everybody is using these technologies, and they're also causing a lot of debate. And the changes are happening faster than the law necessarily. This is the major AI risk timeline. I have to say, so this was, these were dates I pulled from pulling different reports from different institutions about the future of AI. I think the lethal autonomous weapons date is a bit far actually, because it has started right now. But I think this is maybe the time it will take to become more widespread and spread to non-state actors. There's, of course, digital manipulation, structural changes to the workforce, increased inequalities in the world, and AGI around 30 plus years. So why are we talking about this, and why am I telling you about current risk as opposed to AGI? I want to give you a little context about AI ethics so you understand what can be done about existential risk. As I said, we have these new 3 categories of challenges that have emerged in society in the past few years. And at some point, companies understood that it wasn't in their interest to not do anything. One, because technology is not going to be adopted in a widespread way in society if it's not trustworthy. So that's when this notion of trustworthy AI, trustworthy technology really emerged, because companies wanted to make technology trustworthy before placing it on the market so that it continues to grow, they can continue to innovate. The civil society, of course, wanted to address all of the fundamental rights violations that we mentioned. Governments also took it seriously. This quote by Francesca Rossi illustrates the first point about trustworthy AI. It says ethics should not be seen as an impediment to AI. Ethics for AI is like the traffic lights when driving. Without traffic lights or rules, we would not drive faster, we would drive much slower. And so starting 2017, many different ethical frameworks started. The very first one is actually the Asilomar Principles, started by the Future of Life Institute. They gathered hundreds of experts of the field, or experts working on AI from different fields, computer science, policy, the law, and they all agreed on a set of standards that include short-term and long-term considerations. After this, many ethics frameworks emerge. These are just a few examples. The IEEE principles in September 2017, the Montreal Declaration, which is really famous. And in 2019, the Beijing AI principles, the OECD AI principles, the GPA principles. Again, those are examples because there's so many other ethical frameworks. Big companies have also adopted them. Google has their principles, IBM, Microsoft, most governments, the Japanese AI Society published a set of guidelines. And all of this led to a situation where when we say AI ethics now, we mean what has been called soft law, meaning companies self-regulating with no enforcement mechanism. And so recently there has been a lot of debate about this because we've seen that some companies were just adopting ethical guidelines in order to avoid future regulation. And so these concepts were pulled from Floridi's recent paper on the topic, where he where they found definitions for these concepts that were being used in the debate. So there's ethics shopping, the practice of picking convenient standards in different set of principles, ethics washing, implementing superficial measures to appear more ethical than you are, ethics dumping, which is exporting unethical research practices from other geographic areas, where it's not as scrutinized, and ethics shrinking, doing increasingly less ethical works because the returns diminish once you seem to be an ethical company. And so all of these are leading to problems because we realize that ethical standards are not enough. And in fact, we started using legal vocabulary to talk about ethics. As I said, now we talk a lot about soft law. Originally, the field of ethics was philosophical field where we discuss, different ethics that people follow, such as normative ethics or utilitarianism or consequentialist ethics. And today, really, AI ethics has become a mainstream term that exists in opposition to the law, which we call hard law now. And so, is the law a solution then? There are certainly challenges with the law. So one, there is path dependence, especially in countries such as the US, less so Europe, especially in countries such as the US, Canada, or England, which are common law countries where obviously judge's decision always rests upon a previous judge's decision. So for instance, if you look at patent law, AI systems right now are subject to patent law that was created 100 years ago, and that is not adapted at all. The law is often reactive as opposed to proactive. Again, in common law, even more so because it requires a case to be brought to a judge's attention. In Europe, policymakers can be a bit more proactive, which is why I'll tell you about it. We have the AI Act that is proposed by the European Commission right now. But it is still, of course, in response to social debates that emerge, the law has never regulated something that didn't exist yet, such as AGI. And of course, it's also difficult to change the law because people often conflate what is legal to what is just or what is right. We're taught to obey the law from an early age. And so changing the law can seem like a contradiction in itself. AI is bringing new legal challenges, obviously. So one is the intelligence race. And that's actually something that was pointed by the European Parliament in a report recently. It's really interesting because for a long time, policymakers were not talking about AGI. They thought it was science fiction, and people in the field of existential risk were trying to not draw attention to it because they wanted to avoid an intelligence race, such as an arms race for the nuclear, in the nuclear field, for instance. Recently, though, multiple governments, the US government, the EU, have made statements and declarations about AGI, which means that they're aware of the risk, but it also means that they don't want to be the last actor in the world to have it. And so we can end up in a situation that is similar to climate change or similar to nuclear weapons, where it's really a game theory problem and it's very difficult to reach cooperation. Another legal challenge is, of course, research and development. We don't want to completely prohibit any technological development just because of the risk, or maybe we want for certain technologies that pose existential threats. But all of this, we also need to promote beneficial AI. We also need to have existential hope. And so it's the tricky balance. How do you regulate while still promoting beneficial technology? There's, of course, the freedom of speech challenge, which we talk a lot about right now with Facebook, for instance, and techno-optimism. So that's what I was talking about. And it's funny because most people in existential risk are optimistic, but they're also cautious. And that's the balance to strike. today, in terms of AI law, all of these problems are really going on, and so there's not much done. If I take the example of Canada, there's really just one AI directive federally, which only applies to the federal government and federal buildings. In the US, there is no comprehensive law whatsoever on AI. So, for instance, there are a few state bills on data privacy. There are a few state bills on autonomous vehicles. One or two on, there's two in California and Massachusetts on facial recognition. One or two on algorithmic decision making. That's really about it. And Europe is the first geographic zone, the first continent that proposed a more ambitious AI proposal, although it still doesn't really address existential risk. And I want to show you why before concluding this talk. This slide and the four next ones, I really pulled from the European Commission, so I don't want to take credit for. I just changed the colors, but those slides were made by the European Commission, which means that they're a bit more crowded than mine, but they're also very accurate in terms of the law. So basically, the European Union had a roadmap to make AI trustworthy in the past few years, and then released a white paper 2 years ago, and then at the beginning of this year released a comprehensive legislative proposal from the European Commission. It is really good because it is the first comprehensive AI law. It tries to be future-proof. I'll tell you why it doesn't exactly address existential risk, but it is a huge step, and it should take 2 to 4 years to be enacted. It requires the European Parliament to adopt it, the Commission and the Council of the EU to all adopt the same text, and then they would probably have, countries would probably have about 2 years to get up to speed before the law enters into effect. So this proposal is based on Article 114 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the EU. The reason that's important is that, of course, European countries, still have sovereignty on most things, and so the EU can only legislate on things that it's competent to. And so one of those is internal market legislation for the good functioning of the EU and for the circulation of goods and services. The EU has the right to legislate to make goods and services uniform across the continent. It could have also used its competence in terms of fundamental rights, but it didn't. It's not a legislative basis of the text, which is sort of interesting, and certainly a limitation. It also uses competence in data privacy as it relates to the measures on facial recognition in the text. So basically, it's an ex ante legislation. It's about regulating AI before it is placed on the market. So it means that AI systems placed on the market have to comply with certain number of standards. This text is meant to evolve because it hasn't been adopted yet. One major limitation is that it doesn't apply to AI for military purposes because the military domain is still, national sovereignty. It's not of the competence of the EU. So basically, it divides AI systems into different, it put them into a risk framework and divides them into either unacceptable risk, high risk, limited risk, and low risk systems. So unacceptable risks are social scoring and facial recognition, except in certain context for law enforcement and crime investigation, with a limited time and place of use and a judicial approval. So social scoring is completely prohibited. Then you have high-risk systems, and the systems that were considered high risk are basically based on their field of application. So I want to tell you this because when you think of an AGI, it would probably be a system that would not be placed on the market for a specific purpose, whereas the entire European law is based on what purpose will an AI system serve, and that justifies how it's classified in terms of risk. There's limited risk AI systems like chatbots that are considered as just having the requirement of having to self-declare to say, oh, I am an AI, you're interacting with an AI right now. And there's minimal risk systems which have no legal requirement, but they are encouraged to adopt certain ethical guidelines. All of these are high risk. Biometric identification and categorization of natural persons, management and operation of critical infrastructure, education and vocational training, employment and workers management, anything that has to do with public service and benefits, law enforcement, migration, asylum and border control management, and the administration of justice and democratic processes. And so these are subject to these requirements that you see on your screen. They need high quality training, validation, tasting data. They establish documentation and for traceability. You have to have a certain degree of transparency, human oversight, and robustness, accuracy, and cybersecurity. So all of this is before you place your product on the market, and you can have you have to certify. Basically, you have to either get another organization to certify you, and so you go through an assessment, or you can self-certify, but you're still at risk of penalty if you miscertified and if you don't actually meet the requirements. And so then you have the transparency obligations for the limited risk systems. So again, chatbots or systems that could be mistaken for humans. And then you have voluntary ethical standards for low risk systems. Something else that is addressed in the proposal is emotional manipulation. Sadly, they weakened the proposal. It's now very limited to manipulation that would require, I lost the word, but it's when you flash information very quickly in the middle of a video, for instance, so that the person unconsciously sees something and it nudges them. I've given you an overview of AI existential risk and the field of AI ethics right now in the field of AI law. And as you can tell, they seem very disconnected. And so what I want to do right now is try to bring them together, because what we're trying to do at the Future of Life Institute is strike a good balance to prevent existential risk while staying in the present and staying relevant. And that's something that I'm happy to discuss with you further after this talk, or if you email me, and that's something that I want to touch upon right now. So if you look at those short-term issues, they're all relevant to longer-term issues. So if you look at the human rights violations, what can we learn from those cases today that is relevant in the long run? Well, we have to learn how to identify goals, optimize them, and basically align the system with our goals. So if you use the example of human rights violations, there are some systems that were just, violating rights because they were trained in a silly way, or the programmers hadn't foreseen specific consequences. But there's also the question of how do you encode in the system a goal that is a bit more complex than what you're saying. So for instance, if you want to train it to screen resumes, you can just say, please screen resumes to show me the ones that correspond to the candidates I've historically recruited. But you could also say, please screen the resumes and respect value number 1, value number 2, and value number 3. And so what we find right now is that it's very difficult to understand exactly what goals are and what human values are. And that's something that Toby Hard mentioned in his book, which was that not only do we have to actually align the AGI with our goals and include human values, but it's also very difficult just to agree on the human values in the first place. In the case of human rights violations or resumes, we've seen the debate around the Compass recidivism score, which is not even AI actually. It's just an algorithm that is with like advanced statistics and bootstrapping, but it's not even AI. They got a lot of publicity, however, by letting people think it was AI. And if you look at this debate, you see that it generated hundreds of publications by computer scientists discussing the definition of fairness. What does algorithmic fairness mean? Does it mean that it should be as effective? Does it mean it should have the same rate of reoffending, or does it mean it should have the same rate of people who were mistakenly classified as being offender when they didn't reoffend? Or so same rate of false positives, same rates of false negatives. How do you decide what fairness means? And so when we look at these debates, we realize that there is some level of agreement to reach in terms of what the goals are in the first place and what the ethical constraints are, and then you learn to align your system with your goals. And that's something that is relevant to the long run. If you want another example of that, in France in 2017, they adopted a law promoting loyalty of digital platforms to the users. So it says that digital platforms should be primarily loyal to their users, and that if companies have incentives, financial incentives, for instance, to classify or rank content in a different way, they should let users know, and it should be very visible on the page when you use Facebook, when you use Google, when you use digital marketplaces. Again, if you find out how to make sure that an AI is loyal today, you're close to finding how to align it with your goals, which really needs to be figured out before we ever reach AGI. So that's an example of short-term problems that are relevant to the long run. Other ones are the moral conundrums. We talked about the moral machine experiment. What the moral machine experiment shows is that nobody agrees. Just like on the trolley problem, there's a majority of people who say, oh, of course I would pull the switch, but if I had to push someone on the track, I wouldn't. All of this is descriptive ethics, which consists in measuring people's moral intuitions. But we haven't found out a way to find a participatory governance mechanism or democratic governance mechanism to agree on a set of ethical standards that we should consider to deal with these problems. And it becomes even more important when you talk about specific cases of technology where a few individuals could really change the fate of our species. So for instance, if you think about the Mice Against Ticks program that was introduced by this research group at MIT on Martha's Vineyard, where they wanted to change the genetic makeup of the mice on the islands to make them resistant to ticks, so that so that people wouldn't, get infected by ticks and get Lyme disease in the first place. Well, how do you figure out a democratic way to decide to change the genetic composition of an entire population, of an entire species on an island, where it's going to change the course of the life of that species and maybe humans forever? And, how do you even include the future generation in that debate? Like, what do you do? And so these cases today are relevant because, again, we're going to have to deal more and more with emerging technologies that will pose an existential risk to the whole species, not just on an island, not just in the country, but really everywhere. And so those are things that we can do now and work on now with an eye toward what will happen in a few decades. And finally, the structural changes to society, again, they're posing trade-offs that really will be increased by the long-term problems. So for instance, the collective versus the individual, as I said, if you have just one individual getting AGI, they will have an extreme amount of power. In order to prevent existential risk, you need to keep an eye on what your population is doing, because a few individuals could change the course of our species, but you also want to respect democratic values and data privacy, etc. And so all of these things that we're talking about now are actually quite relevant. And I hope that I started to change your mind about this short-term versus long-term framework that we often think about, because sadly, we often have an existential risk community that is perceived as not being grounded in the present anymore. And then we have lawyers and policymakers who are really focusing on what's at stake for their constituent right now. And right now we need to all work together to prepare for these real long-term issues.
Thank you so much, Claire. That was a very, very excellent overview of so many different things going on in AI ethics right now. And I'm sure our audience has learned a lot. We have around 10 minutes left for questions. So I'm going to quickly get into those. So to begin with, there's a question about the plausibility of there being an obligatory version of, say, something like a precautionary principle that could be applied to AI. Do you see any sort of work in that area right now?
Yeah, well, I know, so I know Cass Sustain is in favor, I think, and that I've seen a few papers published on the issue. It's something I'd like to take on, well, I'd like to contribute to, because I think it would be a good idea. I haven't seen any legal debate at the policy making level. Right now, I feel like it's at the idea, at the stage of an idea. And so it would certainly be great if it were adopted, I think, yeah.
Absolutely. And on similar lines, do you think we may have an international treaty that imposes certain regulations on AI and other related emerging technologies? So we do have the EU regulations, but perhaps something bigger and broader at an international level. Do you see that forthcoming?
I hope so. It's certainly, so I mean, part of that will depend partly on the situation between the US and China, obviously, as tensions are rising right now. And so that is not great to set up a forum for them to discuss this issue. And I think part of the potential Cold War that is starting between China and the US is also framed as an issue of digital rights and digital authoritarianism, with Western countries insisting that they're democratic and they're respecting the rights and the digital rights of their citizens, and kind of painting China as using technology for evil purposes. And so based on that, I would love for a treaty to happen, and I'm hoping it will. And I know many organizations are working on that. I hope they succeed. And I think the Chinese versus US situation will influence it. So let's keep our fingers crossed.
Yes, indeed. So we have another question. So this is about Jan Tallinn, who is the co-founder of your institute, who was recently quoted in the Politico that the only way to regulate the technology would be to limit the size of the models. So, quote, the concentration of computation, like building bigger and bigger data centers, is something that you can easily monitor and check. Is this something that more people at the Future of Life Institute are thinking about, or something similar?
We don't have an official position on this issue. Actually, we are Right now we're in a phase of really trying to consult experts and also civil society, and to understand how to, on the one hand, take precautionary measures while also promoting innovation. As I said before, most of us are very optimistic, and we think that AI could be harnessed for good if we knew how to. And so, yeah, so right now there's no official position on this.
Right. So perhaps moving into some more sort of conceptual fundamental questions around AI. So one thing you said about one of the ethical challenges that we might face in this discussion is about individual right violations. And of course, there's this common discussion on how the use or misuse or abuse of AI may violate or maybe infringe upon certain individual rights of humans or non-humans. And along the same lines, there is an argument that's doing the rounds about AI itself having certain rights. What is perhaps your position on it, and where do you see that debate going? Could we think of trade-offs between AI rights versus human, non-human rights?
So this is going to be my personal position, okay? Because there's more position on this at FLI, and I know it's being discussed internally. My personal position is that if there's any chance of consciousness defined as subjectivity of AI systems, we should absolutely give them rights and enforce those. We don't want a situation where we are creating suffering or we're creating some technological slaves. And I would go as far as saying that my position is that we should not create any conscious AI if it's created as a means to a human end. But of course, the question is, well, would we know? Could we potentially create conscious AI without knowing? So AI that has subjectivity, and how would we measure it? And that's why I said there was internal debate at FLI, because I think that they're also trying to get more understanding of that. Would that even be possible, and how could we measure it? And that would really inform, any position would be evidence-based.
Absolutely. And with those discussions of whether or not AI can never be conscious, there is, of course, a discussion that goes hand in hand about how competent AI can be over and beyond the whole question of consciousness and what kind of consciousness at that. And with competence comes the question of, well, does that also mean increase in competence implies increase in the potential controllability aspects of AI, that perhaps ultimately AI can capture more control? And this is a kind of concern that I think Toby Ord also discusses in their book, that it's still speculative, but it's not something that we can completely render sort of implausible. And I think Ord goes to the extent of saying that that possibility should be given more weight than perhaps the possibility of an asteroid collision, even given that that is way less likely than the fact that maybe competent AI can one day gain certain amount of control that we may not want it to. Do you see any plausibility in that line of thinking? Where do you stand on the issue?
Yeah, again, my personal position, I agree with what you said. And I think, it's always good to be skeptical, and it's always good to be open-minded. As a researcher, I try to remember that what used to be mainstream in the past, like the Earth being flat, has turned out to be crazy. Although there's actually so I live in the US, and there's actually a proportion of people who still believe that the Earth is flat. But so I think it's important to remain intellectually honest and consider all possibilities, and also still remain skeptical of the things we hear. I agree 100% with you that AI control should be taken seriously, and there is a lot to be said about small probability events that would be so significant that they should be prepared for.
Right. So how do you think this concern for controllability, or perhaps some something else with regards to AI aligns with the recent developments in regulation. So as you also said that the proposal for regulation has been sort of weakened than what was initially intended. What are some reasons for weakening this proposal, and how does it sit with these concerns about the potential impacts of use of AI?
Yeah, so what was weakened was the part on emotions, emotional manipulation, probably because they weren't quite sure how to distinguish between advertising, nudging, and manipulation. That would be my guess. But you're absolutely right that there are limitations to the current proposal that would not address more generalized systems. Here's the idea. If you buy an iron for your clothes and you decide to straighten your hair with it, your hair is probably going to burn down, and it shouldn't be the company that made the iron that is held responsible, because obviously that wasn't the purpose intended in the first place. And that's been the line of reasoning, you know, in consumer protection, in commercial law for the past 100 years, because it never really happened that we put things in on the market that could be used, you know, kind of for many different things. And that's the case of increasingly generalized systems or multimodal systems. They can be used for multiple purposes. And if you think of a system like GPT-3, for instance, you can really use it for many different things, right? You could just classify some text, or you could create fake news on Facebook. And so I think the EU has this challenge, you know, how to regulate things that don't necessarily have a purpose yet without preventing innovation. And so I think that's the trade-off they had to deal with. And I think that's the reason why this law is not addressing something like AGI. But you're right, as soon as an AGI is on the market, it's basically too late. As soon as an AGI is on the internet, it's basically too late. So of course, you know, there are all these technical solutions that were discussed by Nick Bostrom in his book Superintelligence, and some of his articles about say boxing methods and containment methods and methods to, you know, turn off a switch if in case certain conditions happen. But I think it's also really important to talk to legislators and policymakers right now. And I would invite all of you attending to do so, and to think about new ways of thinking about AI products, because they're not irons. They are products that are reproducible, that are used at large scales, that can evolve throughout the life cycle. And so we do need to think about the law in new ways, because we are at a turning point in humankind, and it's time to do things differently.
Absolutely. And on that positive note, I would like to thank you, Claire, for joining us today and for sharing your insights with us. I learned a lot, and I'm sure so did our audience.